Hi there, this is Dr. Lisa Moyer for FCS 4840, Disadvantaged Family, and this PowerPoint will focus on ethnicity and disadvantage. I like to start out with this quote because it really helps to illustrate and emphasize what this topic is all about. So, as the quote says, we're all created equal, but we're not born into equal circumstances, privilege, status, and class. And I want you to really think about that for a minute. Because we're born into families. We don't have any control over what family we're born into and what circumstances we're born into. So some are born in very wealthy families that have had money for years, have lots of privilege and status, and can help their child to go to or attend the best quality schools, private schools, get music lessons, get private tutoring if necessary, even engage in homeschooling, a lot of travel, able to access things like museums and theater and other things that will help educate them and create a broader worldview, where others are born into families that are struggling and don't have those opportunities. Maybe both parents or just one parent, if it's a single parent family, are working as much as they can, sometimes two jobs, trying to raise their children and give them the best they can, but they don't have a lot of time, they don't have a lot of resources, and it's just not the same circumstances as the family I first described, born into wealth. The reason I point this out is because the United States is known as being a country of opportunity. And it's one of the reasons that many people immigrate here. They want to have the opportunity to become whatever they want. And in some countries, that's not possible due to the way the policy works, or maybe there's aristocrats, or depending on your family name, you have wealth, but if you don't have that family name, you never can. United States is different in that way. However, is it really possible that every single person has the same chance to become a millionaire, to create their own wealth, and to live a life of luxury? Rhetorical question, but I want you to think about it. Is that really true? Do we all have the same chance? When you think about the kinds of resources that families higher up on the socioeconomic scale have compared to the resources that families lower on the socioeconomic scale don't have, it's not possible that they're on the same playing field, that they're on the same equal ground, starting off at the same starting line. I hope that makes sense. I was going to say, does that make sense? And then wait for the class to nod their heads. When I teach face-to-face, of course, that can happen, but this is online. So I hope that does make sense, and I hope that's setting the tone for what we're about to talk about tonight. Well, I always say tonight because I tape my lectures at night, but it may not be night for you. The other thing I like to emphasize is that according to the FBI, every hour someone commits a hate crime. Every day, at least 8 African Americans, 3 Caucasians, 3 LGBTQ youth, 3 Jewish individuals, and 1 Hispanic Latino become hate crime victims. At least. Every week, a cross is burned on someone's lawn, which is a symbol of hate. And every year, more than 500,000 college students are targets of bias-driven slurs or physical assaults. So just realizing the scope of the problem. When we talk about race, ethnicity, and we discuss disadvantage, we're talking about a hot button issue, hot button topic right now in society, and truly has always been. Where I'd like to start is with the film, their clips, actually. It's not a whole film, that focuses on inequality causing illness. And maybe this is not something you've ever thought about before, but people are talking about it more and more. Researchers are finding out more and more about this and really examining just how inequality affects the body. And it does. It certainly does affect the body. And as a result, it can lower the immune system and can make people susceptible to illness. So let's watch this one first. When the Bow Breaks. Oh my gosh, if it doesn't work, I'm going to be so embarrassed. Okay, I guess I had to double click.
The biggest myth about racial ethnic disparities in infant mortality is that people think that this has to do with just socioeconomics, and that the disparities are really the consequences of racial difference in socioeconomic status. And it isn't that simple.
Infant mortality among white American women with a college degree or higher is about 4 deaths per 1,000 births. But among African American women with the same level of education, infant mortality is about 10 per 1,000 births, almost 3 times higher. In fact, African American mothers with a college degree have worse birth outcomes than white mothers without a high school education.
Think about this. We're talking about African American doctors, lawyers, and business executives, and they still have a higher infant mortality rate than non-Hispanic white women who never went to high school in the first place. So what I've been calling for is a rethinking of an old problem from a new perspective, and to really rethink racial and ethnic disparities in birth outcomes from the life course perspective. And simply put, the life course perspective posits that birth outcomes are the product of not simply the 9 months of pregnancy, but really the consequences of differential exposures across the life course of women of color. We know that racism is stressful, and we know that stress can impact on the health in many different ways. It creates this chronic wear and tear on your body's systems to adapt. It wears on the hormonal system, it wears on the immune inflammatory functions, it wears on your metabolic functions, and over time it creates an overload on all of these organs and systems so that they no longer function optimally.
Everyday racism is like gunning the engine of a car without ever letting up. In fact, people who've looked at blood pressures, measuring ambulatory blood pressures for white folks and black folks, young folks, see that the blood pressures might be the same during the day, but at night the white folks' blood pressures would drop, and the black folks' blood pressures would stay the same. And so it is. It's like gunning the engine of that car, just wearing it out without rest. And I think that the stresses of everyday racism are doing that.
And then if you were to carry that into the pregnancy, then that gets embedded in both the pregnancy physiology of the mother and the developmental biology of the child. We certainly have done a lot in terms of increasing access and utilization of prenatal care, especially amongst communities of color, and yet we've done very little to reduce prematurity rates. I think that the problem is that with prenatal care, you're trying to cram all these good things into less than 9 months of prenatal care, and then expecting everything to turn out all right in the end, and to expect prenatal care in less than 9 months to reverse all the cumulative disadvantages and iniquities that's being carried forth over a life course of differential exposures is probably expecting too much of prenatal care. So if we're serious about improving birth outcomes and reducing disparities, we got to start taking care of women before pregnancy, and I'm not just talking about that one visit 3 months preconceptionally, talking about when she's a baby inside her mother's womb, and an infant and a child and an adolescent, and really taking care of women and families across their life course if we really want to do something about improving pregnancy outcomes.
Okay, so that clip focused on racial and ethnic disparities when it comes to pregnancy. And one of the researchers in the film made the comment that it is like gunning the engine of a car all the time for families of color, women of color that are pregnant. That stress, that high blood pressure, it just doesn't let up, even when one is at home and relaxed, because of the effects of racism throughout the lifespan. And not just overt racism, but the microaggressions and the covert forms of racism that occur, and how that affects babies. So, I mean, that's a little upsetting, I'm sure, for many of you to hear if you haven't heard this before. And prenatal care is not going to be enough when the effects have accumulated over the life course. So, like the doctor said, the care needs to start when the baby is in the womb, and we need to try to lessen those effects by increasing equality in serious ways, not just giving lip service to it and saying, oh yeah, we have this rule that is going to help, and no one would say anything bad out loud in class. It goes beyond that, and I know I'm not teaching you anything you don't already know. Let's look at the second clip now. Oh, yeah, I have to double click, don't I?
In looking at diabetes from a broader perspective of poverty and despair and other types of issues that communities face, there is a connection between all of those experiences and the biochemistry and the physiology in the body.
She used to live her. She used to make baskets.
Who broke your house down?
I don't know. But
How could she leave?
she died.
When we think about living in poverty and the stress that people are under, this is not just a public health measure. This is a way of life.
It was a dirt floor. So I remember when we never swept the floor. We always just got the hose and went inside and sprinkled it with water.
And people are worried about whether or not they're going to be able to feed their children or clothe their children or survive a winter. Also, in American Indian populations, we have higher rates of other types of terrible diseases and problems, things like infant mortality. And what a lot of us observe is that these terrible things that happen in terms of the health of a family and a community have an impact on the entire community. And we see things like more self-destructive behaviors, more alcohol and drug intake.
Probably somebody drinking and they got out of hand, probably smoking or something.
Were they in here?
Probably.
And what we see is that early death in communities seems to facilitate more early death in the community. And this is not an objective public health measure. This is a reality of life for people, and it's terribly emotionally charged, and it has all kinds of stressful impact on the body. When we look at measures of stress, we look at different types of hormones like cortisol or epinephrine, which is adrenaline. All of those chemicals increase blood sugar. So not only are people faced with diabetes and high blood sugar, they're faced with stressful living environments in the communities and in the families. And it's those stressors that make the challenge of controlling diabetes that much more difficult.
But it was a bunch, she was drink a lot too, but it was all that stuff just all together,
So there is a direct biochemical connection between the trauma that people face living within a culture of poverty and blood sugar control. And we have to be cognizant of that when we're looking at trying to manage these types of diseases in impoverished communities. But even beyond the cultural differences in beliefs and values, there's also differences in the availability of things like healthy food. So if you're living in an impoverished community, your schools, for example, might not have the resources to pay for physical education and healthy food in the schools. And perhaps they use things like vending machines to try to raise money. So there's a lot of other competing agendas. Just because these children are born into impoverished communities does not mean that they should have to choose between health and education. And that's essentially the circumstances that we put the communities in.
Okay. So hopefully that gives you an overview of the relationship between inequality. The first film looked at racial and health disparities. The second one looked at impoverished communities. And of course, intersectionality combines both of those. So when you have people living in poverty that are also of a racial or ethnic minority group, then you're going to have double the effects of what we're talking about. And obviously that's not good. I think the biochemical connection between poverty and disease like diabetes it's fascinating, and it explains why it's so hard to manage these types of diseases. If you're living in a community, the environment that you live in, surrounded by poverty and early death, even people engaging in self-destructive behaviors as a way to cope with the stress that they're living with, that is going to affect your health. And it's another reason why we shouldn't put families living in poverty all together in one part of a neighborhood or a city, because the effects of that environment spill over and affect everyone around them. Research shows that families do better when they're living in poverty if they're inserted into a middle-class neighborhood or surrounded by parks that are clean and safe places to walk and things that we need in order to survive and thrive. So before we can move on any further, I do want to talk about some important definitions. You may or may not be aware of them. We'll talk first about what race is. And I had you guys engage in Is Race for Real activity this week for discussion purposes. I don't know if you have yet done that, but if you have learned quite a bit about race and how it is considered a biological category and is supposed to refer to genetic differences among groups of people, but those genetic differences really don't hold up. Humans are actually very homogeneous, meaning that they're very alike, very identical. Genetically, humans are 99.9% identical, and most of the differences can be attributed to sex or gender, not race, ethnicity. So it's a culturally created phenomenon, not a biological reality. And that's really important to get, because when it's thought of as a biological category, it is then used to justify poor treatment or giving somebody lesser of, because they're not the same biological category as the majority race. So, you can see where that would lead to problems. Racism is a system or doctrine which states that inherent biological differences, so again, buying into that biological differences theory between human races, determine cultural or individual achievement. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. So if we continue with this idea that race is a real biological category, then it makes it easier to also buy into racism. Ethnicity is the term that most people use and prefer, and at least people are moving to race/ethnicity, so that's helping. But that refers to cultural and sometimes physical characteristics used to classify people into groups or categories considered to be different from others. So that's a much more accurate term, and it captures really what we're talking about, because it's not just physical characteristics. We're talking about cultural differences. And people can look alike and be from completely different cultures and have completely different values and lifestyles and principles, etc. So, I mean, you can't classify people. If you've engaged in the is race for real activity, you know that if you try to classify people based on how they look, you're going to fail. It doesn't work. And so that's why I had you guys do that activity. Prejudice, making assumptions about an individual based upon beliefs about the group that they belong to. Those beliefs are not necessarily true, but they're beliefs that somebody holds. Discrimination is acting based on prejudices. Ethnocentrism is a preference for one's ethnic group and believing that people outside of that group are no good. Your group is better. Xenophobia refers to the fear of things that are foreign or different and can include people that are different. Miscegnation is having views against interracial relationships or interethnic relationships. Stereotyping is believing or holding generalizations about a specific group. And then finally, affirmative action is a set of public policies and initiatives designed to eliminate past and present discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, and/or national origin. And we will actually be talking more about that in a moment. Okay, usually when I get to this part and I'm in a face-to-face classroom, sometimes it can become heated, I have to be honest. The concept of white privilege is a difficult one for white people to own and understand. Not so difficult for people that are not white to understand. And I want to emphasize that just because, well, let me define what it is first, and then we'll talk about that. So, what is white privilege? Okay, it's a right, advantage, or immunity granted to or enjoyed by white persons beyond the common advantage of others. An exemption in many particular cases from certain burdens or liabilities. Now, you don't have to believe that white privilege exists to benefit from white privilege. Research has shown us very clearly that white privilege exists. And privileges exist in other ways too. Of course, having money would give one privilege. And where one lives could give one privilege. But we're talking about privilege based only on the color of one's skin. And most white people don't recognize white privilege, and they don't even understand that it exists because they just live it. They use it, and they don't even know they're using it. Or it's used for them. They don't even know it. And I find that one of the reasons that white people get upset about white privilege is they believe it undermines their own personal struggle. So, for example, I've came from a family of, poverty. We did not have a lot of money when I was little. And although we struggled and worked hard, and I did work hard to get to where I am today, that doesn't mean that my white privilege did not help me get here. But it upsets white people sometimes because it seems that that's what I'm suggesting or what the concept of white privilege is suggesting. And that's not true. It's just understanding that it did help whether you like it or not. So Peggy McIntosh and I posted the article on D2L for you guys to read. It's a great article to read. It's a short article, so you should just be able to whip right through it. And it's not written like other articles. It's really easy to read. So, and she gives examples of white privilege. And this is a bit dated. I mean, this was written in the 80s, but a lot of these still apply. So, for example, White people are almost never asked to speak for all white people. White people can remain oblivious to the language and customs of persons of color who constitute the world's majority without feeling any penalty for such oblivion. White people can buy posters, postcards, picture books, greeting cards, dolls, toys, and children's magazines featuring people of their race very easily. White people can go home from meetings or most organizations feeling tied to the other members rather than isolated, out of place, outnumbered, unheard, held at a distance, or worse, feared. White people can be sure if they need medical or legal help, their race won't work against them. White people can take a job with an affirmative action employer without having coworkers on the job suspect they got it because of their race. White people can arrange to be in the company of people of their own race most of the time. White people can worry and even advocate about racism without being labeled as self-interested or self-serving. White people can declare that there is a racial issue at hand or there isn't a racial issue at hand and be taken more seriously than a person of color. And finally, white people can do well in a challenging situation without being called a credit to their race. Peggy McIntosh, the full article, that's not what I posted, I just posted part of it, has a lot more examples of that. But that is what we're talking about. And so again, it's not things that you necessarily control. It's a system that's been set in place for a long time, since the United States began and started taking over the land from American Indians and bringing over African Americans and enslaving them and making white the color of dominance and privilege. And that has passed down from generation to generation. And even though we have lots of laws and policies on the books to prevent discrimination based on race or ethnicity, we are continually plagued by discrimination, and it hurts all of us. Okay, so minority families in the U.S. Just some basic statistics. Overall, about a third of the U.S. population falls into what is considered a minority category, simply meaning they're not part of the majority race ethnicity, which is currently Caucasian. I say currently because that is expected to change over time, and that's about the same in Illinois. And ethnic minority families are at a higher risk for poverty, discrimination, and factors associated with both of these issues. And that's why we're talking about it. I don't really like the term minority. It's not a term that I prefer. It seems less than minor compared to major. You know what I mean? But people do use that term still today. I only use it when I think that it's part of a necessary definition or necessary to explain what I'm talking about. But it is to just throw around that somebody is a minority it's insulting, it's offensive. So be careful of your language. It's not something I would recommend throwing around. Now let's talk about affirmative action. And again, this is a topic that in the classroom can oftentimes lead to heated discussion. And most of the time, people don't really even understand affirmative action or what it is. They've just heard things, oftentimes from family members or from other people of influence in their life, that have made snarky, nasty comments about affirmative action, and they believe it without exploring it and just repeat what they've heard. So let's start with some legal history when it comes to policy. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed. It abolished and made slavery illegal, as well as involuntary servitude. You could no longer make anyone your slave. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in 1868. It guaranteed equal protection under the law for all races, ethnicities. The 15th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in 1870. It forbid racial discrimination in access to voting and gave everyone the right to vote. However, it took almost a century for that act to be enforced, interestingly enough. And even today, you see one of the issues that's being debated in the state of Illinois is requiring people to have ID in order to vote, like either having a state ID card or license. And there can be barriers to obtaining both of those for people that live in poverty. And that's one of the reasons that there's a big argument against it, because that will limit who can actually vote. And there shouldn't be anything in place stopping anyone that it has the legal right to vote. So if you start requiring some type of identification that not everybody can just get very easily for free without having to leave their house, then that's not fair. Okay, in 1954, kind of moving forward here, Brown versus the Board of Education abolished segregation in public school systems and other public places. In 1963, the Equal Pay Act was passed. It made it illegal to pay men and women differently for the same type of work when equal skill, education, experience, effort, responsibility, etc. applied. And then in 1964, the Civil Rights Act passed, which prohibited discrimination in public facilities, in government, and in employment. Support for enforcing the law was very weak at first. And I'm sure as I'm reading through these, you're thinking, well, some of these, still apply. I mean, like the Voting Act, we know that men and women are not paid equally for the same type of work when all things are held equal. So we continue to struggle with it since 2016. The Voting Rights Act outlawed discriminatory voting practices aimed primarily at preventing African Americans from voting. So, again, there's another act passed about voting. Why is voting such a big deal? Well, because we're a democracy, and voting, we have power. Individual citizens have power with the right to vote. And that if you prevent a certain group from voting because you don't want them to vote against you, then you're more likely to win. And again, that's not fair. To me, this is all like cheating at Monopoly. Fair Housing Act, passed in 1968, outlawed discrimination associated with the renting or purchasing of a home based upon someone's background, their age, their gender, their religion, or their race, ethnicity, as opposed to their financial background or status. This includes advertising, mortgage lending, homeowners insurance, and zoning. Oh God, I can't talk. Interestingly enough, when I moved to Alabama and was searching for a house to rent, there were parts of town that the real estate agent that was showing us around referred to as, you don't want to live there, that's the wrong side of the tracks, these neighborhoods don't have that many blacks, there might be one black family here, so this is a good place to live. And moving from Maine, where very few African American people actually live, so I did not have a lot of exposure to this kind of discrimination. It was shocking to me. It was just, you read about it, but to actually witness it and hear it was just, I cried after we were done searching for a house because it was so upsetting to me. Okay, the phrase affirmative action was first used under the Kennedy administration in a 1961 executive order. If you want to know what number that is, it's 10925. And then Lyndon Johnson's executive order in 1965, number 11246. In 1967, Johnson expanded affirmative action to include women. So, what is affirmative action? It refers to policies that take gender, race, or ethnicity into account in an attempt to promote equal opportunity and increase ethnic diversity in workplaces and schools. It is not a quota program. And that's something I really need for you guys to understand. It's how is affirmative action carried out? What does it do? The purpose is twofold: to maximize diversity in all levels of society, along with its presumed benefits, and to redress perceived disadvantages due to overt, institutional, or involuntary discrimination. So, how does this happen? By doing the following: encouraging hiring agents and contractors to make good faith efforts to meet goals and timetables for the employment of minorities and women in fields where they have been typically underrepresented. However, in spite of this, minorities still tend to lag behind their white counterparts in education attainment and in the job marketplace. The biggest concerns about affirmative action is over quotas. And I know I have here, major concerns: reverse discrimination, and that unqualified individuals are getting jobs. The unqualified individuals getting jobs is what we're referring to when we're talking about quotas. Affirmative action programs, here's what they do. And I've sat on search committees for Eastern, and they're very serious about affirmative action and providing equality in the search. And you're required to make sure you do certain things when you're searching for a candidate. For example, when you advertise a position, you have to make sure that you advertise in all kinds of areas, not just one. The Chronicle of Higher Education is a classic place to advertise a job for a professor. But this is an institution that has been overrun with white men and even white women. So you want to make sure that you also advertise in professional organizations that are either include more diverse populations or have the focus of diversity or something related to it, so that the job gets advertised everywhere and everyone has the chance to apply, not just certain people who see certain publications. I hope that makes sense. So affirmative action programs verify that inequities exist, set goals to eliminate those inequities, set timetables to meet the goals, which are not always met, but you have to have some type of timetable. You can't just simply say, I hope that we improve diversity, and that be it. If you don't set goals and timetables, then you don't have things to work towards. And then affirmative action is actually disbanded if the program goals are met. And that's the problem. They're hardly ever met. So we continue with affirmative action because it's needed. So opponents argue that setting a goal is setting a quota, meaning that a specific outcome is mandated rather than highly desirable. But that's not what affirmative action does. Rarely do you see that this year, say I'm working for the University of Maine and we're setting our goals. This year we are going to hire 20 African American professors. Well, 20 African American professors have to be available and meet the qualifications and want to move to Maine and teach in an area where very few African American families actually live. That's going to be a difficult task. And it involves more than just simply advertising the position everywhere. And it's a systematic problem, and it involves a systematic solution. Keeping professors of color at Eastern has been difficult because there's very few resources and networks. And you don't want to live somewhere where you don't feel comfortable. And that's just ridiculous. If you're wanting to work and your career is a big part of your life and you're wanting to be happy, you're not going to pick somewhere, at least not intentionally, that you're going to not have access to other people that are like you, or even resources, so you may have to drive 3 hours to get your hair done properly. I mean, that's just crazy. That's not fair. So Reverse discrimination. Let's talk about that now. Less than 2% of the employment discrimination cases argued before the EEO are cases brought forth by Caucasians. So that means 98% are cases brought forth by people of color. Perhaps more importantly, even fewer are proven. So if somebody feels they have been reverse discriminated against, they can't prove that they have, because most likely that's not what's going on, or it's not happening, or there's not enough evidence. So, yes, reverse discrimination is an interesting concept, in my opinion, because it implies that you can discriminate against the majority race ethnicity. And that really is not possible, because part of discrimination and getting away with discrimination and using discrimination is to belittle and keep people down. And when you look around and everywhere you see people of your own race, ethnicity in seats of power, they're the bosses, the supervisors, etc., it's very difficult to argue that a white person is being discriminated against in a situation like that. Where on the flip side, if you have an African American woman and a Hispanic man working for a company where most of the positions of power are occupied by white people, then discrimination is a whole different type of situation in that case. And to be irritated at being constantly having to be on guard and having your motor running, like we talked about with the health, and then to have a snarky comment interpreted as reverse discrimination, you see where I'm going with this? It's difficult. I do have another video that I think it's cute, but it really does help emphasize why we need affirmative action in place.
Hello, Henry.
Okay, so one of my favorite little movie clips really helps to illustrate what I'm trying to tell you in this PowerPoint and explain is that you may have noticed that the race didn't start for the African American players until 1964 because of the Civil Rights Act. And then there were all these barriers that are still in place. So even though you might say this is no longer legal, there are still other problems that exist that haven't been resolved yet. And that's the problem. I mean, that's the issue. It's like Dr. Sherwood explains how she was playing Monopoly with her cousin when she was a child, and her cousin was cheating and taking money out of the bank. She was the banker and had access to the money. And when Dr. Sherwood discovered that this was occurring, she got angry, of course, and said, I don't want to play anymore. And her cousin said, no, keep playing. I won't cheat anymore, I promise. Well, the damage has already been done by the cheating. So it's not an equal game at that point. It's not equal until everyone starts over and everybody has equal access. So how can we equal the playing field without affirmative action? If I do, when I have this discussion in class and people are debating whether or not affirmative action is effective or not, then I always pose the question, well, without affirmative action, what do you suggest we do? So maybe you have some ideas, I don't know. But that's the best that we've come up with as a country now. I don't know what will happen in the future, but if you have ideas, you should certainly pose them. I hope that at least you now understand what affirmative action is and what it isn't, and how it's intended only to set guidelines to help increase equality. And it doesn't mean that you set a timetable and say this has to be done by 2020. Well, you want it to be done by 2020, and then you can set a goal, but that doesn't mean that you accept people that are unqualified for positions just to fill a role or fill a quota. That's not even possible. I mean, when I was on the search committee, we had to explain why we were looking at every single candidate that we were and why we were thinking of inviting certain ones. And we had to have clear, rational, logical arguments with facts and data. You couldn't just simply say, because we like this person. They had to be qualified in order to be invited to campus, regardless. So they had to fit the qualifications, and you learn that when you're using affirmative action and when you're in place and you're being guided by affirmative action, you understand that this is all just to help everybody have a chance. And that's all that I've got tonight. It's a long one, but an important lecture. Okay, bye-bye.